As we begin our lecture on early Christian Byzantine design and Islamic design, I just need to restate that this class speaks about many world religions and seeks to understand design in the face of people's spiritual belief system. So I'm not advocating for or against any religion. I think it's a very personal choice. And again, it's just to explain it within the context of our design history. So what I think a perfect symbol for that is Hagia Sophia, seen here behind the fountain, which started life as a Christian church in Byzantine style, then became a Islamic mosque, and since the 1930s has become a museum and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So again, these two great religions, world religions, are coexisting side by side within the very confines of this building. And so we also see on this slide some beautiful Iznik tile work that is clouding what's commonly called the Blue Mosque. So we'll dissect some of these details and why things are built in these fashions on this slideshow. In the early centuries of the Christian faith, much of this geographic area was still held under Roman control and Roman influence. Other cultures were affecting this area, of course, as we found out through trade routes, travel, and military campaigns. But again, the Roman style and government still has held sway in these areas. And it was illegal to be a Christian in these early days. So we'll see how this is going to affect the design of some of these early Christian churches. During this time, the Roman Empire, because it was so vast, became hard to manage. And so under the rule of Diocletian in 285, and he was reigning from 285 to 306, the empire was split into half, with the East and the Western Roman Empire. And so we see a profound shift in design during this time too, with the Western Roman Empire early Christian designs kind of differing in quite a bit, in many ways, from the Eastern Roman Empire, which had a strong influence of Asia and the Middle Eastern design aesthetics. So when we talk about the Eastern Roman Empire, the capital of that was Byzantium. And this was a city that was founded by a Greek named Byzas, who was had grown up or was from Megara, which is the area near Athens. But in 657 BC, he went to the Oracle of Delphi to ask for advice, and she recommended that he create a city right here in the location which is now modern-day Istanbul. So let's take a look at that location next. So you can see with this map of modern-day Istanbul that the Bosphorus, the strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, is an essential strategic location. So you can see Europe butting up to Asia, and that strait, between the two. Then, of course, if you can think of all the trade going on, that becomes a powerful location to control. And so we also see what's called the Golden Horn, which is a prime location in this area that will be the site of many of these important buildings that we're about to see. Delphi, which is located just north of Athens, is a site that has been a location for this oracle, some say as early as 1400 BC, in the middle of the Mycenaean period. And that there is at that time, the temple was dedicated to the goddess Gaia, the Earth Mother. But then there's evidence that Apollo, the priest from Apollos, took it over, and it became a shrine to Apollo. So the oracle was said to be delivering, and she's like a seer and a psychic, if you will. She is delivering messages from Apollo, was the thought. So between the 6th to 4th century and then during the classical period, this was the kind of the high time of the oracle, and from again about the 7th century BC until 4th century AD, people would continue to consult the priestess. So of course it wasn't the same one after another. She would be called the Pythia, which is the a derivative from the original name of the area, which is Pythos. So the point is, she would sit on this tripod stool over a crack in the rock, and it was said that at this location there would be sulfurous fumes that would rise up from underground in the earth, and this would put her into a trance state, and different leaders and people would come to consult with her and get prophecy and advice about what they should do. And so this is where Byzas came to receive that advice to build a city in that particular location in what is now modern-day Turkey. So here's perhaps a more clear graphic of how the empire was split up, with the red areas being the Western Roman Empire and the purple being the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire is going to continue to have strong Roman design influences, and the Eastern Roman Empire will have Eastern design influences. So later it was called Christianized Greek culture in the Eastern the Roman Empire, and Byzantine art became more symbolic and less naturalistic as a byproduct of Asian influences. So we'll see that coming up too. The Western Roman Empire was experiencing some destabilizing elements due to un-Roman people in the outer parts of the empire battling the Roman legions, and the Romans suffering quite a few severe defeats. And these were some internal problems that were leading to civil unrest and economic decline. And then also Germanic invaders such as the Goths and the Vandals coming down and actually, taking over parts of the Roman Empire in the West as well. So we'll see how this will affect the designs coming up. But just to give you some context of why they were moving the capital from place to place at this time of the Western Roman Empire. So as I said, in the Eastern Roman Empire, they were starting to take on more Eastern or Asian style of art, and they were creating these icons where the human figure was stylized instead of having a naturalistic appearance that had been popular and sought out during the classical period. So you can see the statue of the classical carving of Zeus there on the left, and his three-dimensional effects and lifelike pose and musculature and all of that. So what the early Christian images were seeking to do was to make these images less lifelike. So in other words, not a mere human. They were stylizing it into these symbolic ways to, again, show that the fact that they were above human. Here we see an image of Constantine I, or now called Saint Constantine. He was a Roman emperor from 306 to 337 AD, and he won civil wars against other emperors vying for power, Maxentius and Licinius, to emerge as the sole ruler of both the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. He's significant because he had a vision during one of his battles. He saw a vision of a shield with a cross on it in 312, and he thought it was a sign from God to convert to Christianity, to this new faith. So you can see, Christianity already had been around for several hundred years, but he decided to create what's called the Edict of Milan, which declared tolerance towards Christianity in the empire, where before there was persecution of Christians in the empire. So this was an important edict for Christians because this gave them the freedom to worship and the right to organize churches. And we'll see some of the early churches being built after this. Emperor Constantine recognized the strategic and military advantages of the location of Byzantium, and he decided to make the capital of the Roman Empire in this location, where first it was called New Rome, but others wanted to name Constantinople in his honor, so it was christened that name in 330 AD. This is where Greek classicism survived, so manuscripts copied from Homer and Virgil and other important classical authors were held preserved in Constantinople, and also much artistic inspirations and artisans gathered in this city. So a lot of the classical world was retained, for 1,000 years in Constantinople, where it started to get lost in the Western Roman Empire. During this early Christian design period, being a Christian was not legal. So the early Christians were faced with the problem of trying to find architecture that was appropriate for this new religion. So you might think to yourself, if you had to design a building from scratch to accommodate a new belief system, you might ask yourself, what are some of the factors that would come into play to design that space? Well, one of the factors in the early Christian time period was secrecy. So they designed these catacombs for underground burial chambers, as well as places of worship. And this image painted on the ceiling of one of the catacombs is the one, like I said here, one of the earliest known images of Christ being depicted with a beard. On the next slide, which we'll talk about also, you can see they were burial crypts as well. In the Christian tradition, of the idea of the body physically resurrecting was important. So unlike the Romans that tended to cremate people upon death, Christians wanted a intact body burial. So this is another reason why the catacombs were created. And this was built under the streets of Rome, and carved out of what's called tufa. So it's the soft stone that exists in that area that we see the Romans had used for carvings as well. But after they carved down, this is actually a chamber called a cubiculum, which is a chamber that creates a mortuary chapel. So these niches would have been for a wealthy person's burial, wealthy family's burial. We know that they were wealthy because they were using cinnabar paint, which was a very costly material. And then again, you see that painting on the ceiling of the bearded Christ. As I said, the icons, which is from the Greek word ikones, were starting to become the way to depict spiritual figures. So sacred images of saints, Christ, Virgin Mary, and so forth were crafted in all media, including marble, ivory, ceramics, gemstones, metal, enamel, textiles, frescoes, and mosaics. And the thought was, as you contemplated these images, you're connecting with the figure represented. This is something that's still used today by many people, this idea of an icon. This particular one is crafted in cloisonne, which is again that idea of taking metal and then soldering metal chambers on the metal plate, then filling those chambers with glass enamel, firing it again, and that creates these decorative scenes like you can see here and on the next slide as well. On the left, you see a Byzantine reliquary from Constantinople that is an icon of Christ from 1100 AD in cloisonne. So it gives you a good look at those metal chambers with the enamel colors. And then on the right is a carved ivory icon of Saint Demetrios from about 950 AD. Excuse me. He's a popular saint in the Byzantine military. Often carried a icon of Saint Demetrios because he was said to protect the faithful in battle. So that's why you see him in armor with a shield and a sword. Looks like, or like a thing of arrows. Meanwhile, back in the Western Roman Empire, the Visigoths were a western branch of invaders originally from Sweden and part of the Germanic tribes that dissolved the Western Roman Empire ultimately through invasion. We're continuing to put more pressure on the Western Roman Empire. So we'll see how that affects the designs coming up in this time period as well, and in the next time period when we talk about Romanesque design. So you can see here in the Sassanid Empire pushing in from the east. So that's the green area. It's labeled Persian Empire. This was a dynasty of Persian kings from the 3rd to the 7th century AD. And their territory included Iran, Iraq, and Eastern Arabia, Syria, Armenia, parts of Egypt and Turkey as well. And they are pulling their influence in from the east. And then you can see the other tribes I was talking about kind of pushing down from the north and from the west on the Western Roman Empire, which again is starting to create changes in design due to these new influences. As the government started to destabilize, people started to break off again into smaller kingdoms and smaller warring factions. And this was sometimes called then the Dark Ages, because that was the loss of the classical knowledge and the classical forms of government that had been put forth during the Greek and Roman time periods. But in fact, it was a Dark Age. And of course, let me back up again a bit. Many scholars refute that there was this Dark Age, that they said, these kinds of knowledge, this kind of knowledge was held all along in things like monasteries and other factions. It just, the general, as you can see, the life expectancy of the average person was about 35 years old. So for the average person, it was a Dark Age. Anyhow, it was literally a Dark Age because there was all of these cooling events happening due to volcanic eruption. So if you recall that island of Thera and Akrotiri, where they had that explosive eruption which destabilized the Minoan society, this series of eruptions was a phenomenon going around all of Earth between 535 and 536. So, for example, there's a small eruption of Mount Vesuvius. There was a eruption in what's called Lake Pongo in what is now El Salvador. There was thought to be a eruption of Krakatoa down in Indonesia near Java. And so all of these different volcanic eruptions resulted in 2 years of cooling on the earth with that ash veil. So this meant that crops failed, which killed millions of people through famine. This also was a time of plague. A lot of people died of the plague. And this phenomenon was discussed in places, far flung from each other as China, where they were talking about the light is frail and its light is only a feeble shadow. So they were saying the light was like during the time of a solar eclipse, if you can kind of imagine that darkened atmosphere. The tree rings also show tiers of acidic dust, meaning there was less growth in tree rings, excuse me, during that 2-year period. So this resulted in many different political or historical consequences. So, for example, we found hoards of gold by Viking cultures. They were sacrificing gold, what's called votive figures, to the gods to try to appease them. It also was thought to help result in the decline of Teotihuacan, that area that is now around Mexico City, due to droughts and famine. The plague of Justinian that came in killed about 25 million people across the Middle East and Europe. There was snow in China in August, and again, different empires fell. So it was a time of a lot of upheaval and darkness during that particular section of human history, I should say. During this time period then of unrest and uncertainty, we see the reemergence of this kind of defensive architecture, which is called a fortress. And notice it's located on a high location so that they can see any kind of invading forces coming toward them, with a small access point into the town and also defensive walls built around it. as I asked you, try to imagine if you had a new religion and you had to design a building that would be suitable for the style of worship that you were doing. It might be natural then to look around what was done in the past and use that as a template. And that's exactly what happened when Constantine authorized the building of a large church in Rome that would house the shrine of St. Peter and would be able to accommodate thousands of pilgrims coming to visit those relics. They looked to the old form of the Basilica. And the Basilica had been, again, in continual use since the 2nd or 3rd century, which is a large meeting hall that had a large central area, which we'll call the nave, and subdivided with side aisles. And this was originally meant as an open forum public building that was used as the courts. And so they'll use this particular form seen here as the Basilica form for these first Christian churches. So this is the drawing of Old St. Peter's, which is called that because then at some point it was destroyed and new St. Peter's was built on the location of now what is now the St. Peter's at the Vatican. And again, in 324, Constantine authorized this buildings. So when we look at Old St. Peter's, you can see the nave, that large central aisle, which with the apse at the end, again, which was taken from Roman forms of building. And then we have the 2 side aisles. And this was to accommodate the way people worshiped then. So they took on the same kinds of customs that they did when they were worshiping the Roman gods and goddesses, which I remember people would have processionals around temples and not really participate actively in the service, would be more of a witness to the service. So these side aisles were for the congregation to stand and observe processionals done by the priests up to the apse where they had the altar. And this was the custom for many centuries. So pews in churches didn't arrive until later. Again, notice again the colonnade on either side, or what's called an arcade, which are, you can see the row of columns, and then the next row over you can see the columns with the arches. So the columns with the arches is called an arcade. And then again, the focal point of the church then would be the apse, the semicircular extension at the east end, which tended to display some kind of a mosaic or some kind of a focal point for worship. So Old St. Peter's was located in Rome, and again, this was the location that is now where we have New St. Peter's Basilica. And a basilica denotes a church with special rites. So, for example, it's usually a large, very important church that has special ceremonial rites that were designated by the Pope. Okay, and then we're going to look at some other early Christian churches, and in this case, we're going up to the area of Ravenna. So if you look there on the part of the boot that's between Florence and Venice, you'll see that town, where we'll go next. When you look at the facade of St. Apollinaire in Ravenna, this is typical of the early churches in that the exterior is using Roman building technology, such as the Roman barrel vaulted arch, the arcade with the arches and the columns, a trussed roof, so the triangular shaped roof, and then the use of brick. I remember the Romans were very good at using masonry or brickwork. And these early churches tended to look very plain and humble on the outside, and all the splendor was on the inside. So you can imagine if you're walking into this somewhat humble looking building, and then all of a sudden you're confronted with these incredible designs, that would make a big impression to these early worshipers. This was named after Apollinaris of Ravenna. He was a person from Syria who had been persecuted by the Roman emperors. He was run through with a sword after being tortured, so he was the first bishop of Ravenna, and this basilica was constructed in 549, on the side of his martyrdom. And so let's take a look inside. Important details to note, which are typical of these early churches, is the use of the apse on the altar. So this is taken from the Roman baths of Caracalla. And also notice the use of the Roman barrel vaulted arch in the arcade, again that repeat of column and arches, and the repurposing of the Roman columns. So they took columns from the Roman temples and then repurposed them in these churches. But we'll see kind of Roman design motifs as well. Notice the rondelles. And in this case, instead of showing a Roman god or goddess, they're showing different figures from the Bible. And then also the use of the wooden truss to support the roof structure. So the central aisle again is the nave, and then that typically has a clear story of glass. You can see those windows up top. And then again, the side aisles for the congregation to observe the processionals going down that large central aisle. Inside, as I said, the outside's very plain, the inside's much more decorative. We see the use of the Roman mosaic, but using even tinier pieces than the Romans did to try to create these very intricate mosaics, which we call Byzantine mosaic work. So the tesserae were applied directly on the floor, wall, vault, or dome surface that had been prepared with 2 to 3 layers of plaster, and then they would sketch a preliminary design on that, and then they use very closely spaced tessera, or those pieces, to create very delicate details, which we'll see on the next slide, that included, subtle shadings and transitions that made things look more three-dimensional. So here you get a good look at those repurposed Roman columns and the use of the mosaic technique on all these different faces and on the church, on the different parts on the interior. And these also were instructional in nature, so they would show different scenes of the Bible, similar to how the stained glass is going to serve that purpose. And later in the Romanesque and Gothic churches, these sought to illustrate different scenes from this new faith and act as instructional guides to new worshipers. The other thing that these mosaics will do is give us a clue as to the type of clothing people wore, the type of houses, the architectural detail, even in some cases the furniture. You can see the use of the curtain as a hanging in the door as opposed to having a door on a hinge. And we get a lot of information about customs and lifestyles from these early Christian mosaics. We also see the influence of designs from the East. So if you will recall the jale screens from India, the iron net in Sanskrit, that creates these decorative patterns. And then notice these kind of endless fret and knot motifs. Also the use of the Greek cross, where the vertical and the horizontal members are the same length. So again, these carved stone pierce work functions much the same way as the ones we saw in the Taj Mahal, where it brings in different light patterns into the space, brings cool air into the space as the air passes through those smaller passages. And of course, again, it has symbolic meaning in this case as well. Now we get to the fascinating story of Emperor Justinian, who is considered the last Roman emperor and who reigned from 527 to 565 AD, and his empress Theodora. Justinian was born in 482 in Thrace, which is now modern-day Macedonia. His uncle was a Roman military commander in Constantinople, and instead of staying on the farm, he was invited to go and live with his uncle in Constantinople, and he became his assistant. And through a long series of events, the uncle eventually rose to be the emperor, and only reigned for a short time, under about 9 years, but he was quite elderly by this point. He was in his late 60s, which was very old for the time. So Justinian really took over a lot of his administrative duties. And Meanwhile, Theodora had started life in very humble beginnings as a circus performer and an actress. And then unfortunately, when her father died, she and her mother and sisters fell into prostitution to try to support themselves, knowing, women had no other way to earn money back in this day, really. So she had a long arc of a journey too, but she ended up converting to Christianity and settling in Constantinople to be a wool weaver, where Justinian met her. And there, there's love stories, one for the ages. He actually changed the laws of the land to marry her, because at this time it was illegal for anybody to marry a prostitute. He treated her as an intellectual partner, and she was said to be very intelligent. And she then started to lobby for new laws so that women had more rights, that women had guardianship of their own children. She lobbied to close the brothels and convert them to convents, and to try to convert more people to Christianity, along with Justinian. So they actually made Christianity the official religion of the empire and outlawed paganism and other religions. So in this context, we see the Church San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, what is now Italy, from 526 AD, which is the only church from the period of Emperor Justinian to survive intact to today. And it's the largest and best preserved of the Byzantine mosaics in Europe. And we'll see some scenes, in a moment. But notice the building itself is quite unusual in its layout, and it's got this kind of central plan with a complex geometry of interlocking volumes. So it's laid out a little bit differently than what we saw with the Basilica form with the old St. Peter's. San Vitale has an octagonal floor plan, which is the octagon is in Christian symbolism is meant to represent the 6 days of creation, the day God rested, and the 8th day of resurrection, basically through baptism. So we'll often see baptistries, places where people go to get baptized, done with these octagon shapes. And then notice all the apses set around that central circular portion of the sanctuary. So inside the sanctuary, you see some of the largest and best preserved Byzantine mosaics. And it's showing different Old Testament scenes and scenes from the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when we look at the Byzantine mosaics, notice the use of the gold. So they were using gold tessera glass, and this created this very shimmering effect that was meant to symbolize bringing heaven to earth, or looking up at the roof that would become the dome of heaven. So when you look at the mosaic of Justinian from San Vitale, this is at the foot of the apse. Notice he's wearing Tyrian purple for his cloak, which shows his power. Also, he's got a golden halo on, so they're elevating him to more of a holy person, as well as showing him to be the head of both church and state, in the fact that he's got soldiers on one side and the clergy on the other. He's also holding the bread for the communion of the Eucharist, showing again that he's the leader of the church itself. The mosaic of Theodora shows her holding the wine, again elevating her to as one of the leaders of the church. So that would have been the wine again for the communion. Notice also the Byzantine style of dress. So women wore these very elaborate hairstyle, or headpieces, in this case with kind of dripping pearls and semi-precious gemstones. And they typically wore, wealthy people, very fine textiles. So these were evidence again of that trade with Asia, with some of the silks and beautiful textiles that would be worn. You can also see the way the Byzantine mosaics enable more detail because of those very small pieces and shaded details in that. Notice like the white cloak, for example, that has all the folds in it, or even the shading or the contouring on the faces with the highlights and shadows. The bell tower will be another symbol that will be used in many churches, and it goes back to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you're going to see in a moment in Jerusalem, but it becomes a staple of church design to call people to worship. Also notice the use of the piers, which are those kind of vertical supports for the roof of the building. And then on the next slide, we're going to see what's called a flying buttress, which is a arc that helps shore up the load on the outside of the building. So here's the depiction of Christ with the four evangelists. But if you can imagine yourself back in time, living a very humble life with, of course, not much exposure to the outside world, such as things we have now, such as social media, television, and movies, and so forth. And then you walk into a structure like this and see these incredibly beautiful mosaics. It really would leave you weak at the knees, which was the intended effect, right? So it has had a big impact to people through the centuries. And again, all that gold and creating that shimmering light. One person that was very much influenced by these Byzantine mosaics was the artist Gustav Klimt. And we'll see one of his pieces inspired by his trip to Ravenna. So he was actually invited by a wealthy patron to travel to Italy with the family, and he was able to see these mosaics for himself. And Klimt's father had been a goldsmith, so Klimt already had a kind of an affinity toward gold. But we'll see that in one of his phases of his paintings, which is his golden phase on the next slide. We will talk more about Gustav Klimt, a very notable Austrian artist, in a few classes from now. But note, this is just to show you that this particular style of painting that he did was inspired by those mosaics. One motif that we'll see used in both Christian symbolism and in Islamic symbolism is this idea of kind of a vase of life, what I call vase of life motif, where it shows a vase with some kind of plants winding out of it in a geometric kind of rhythm. In this case, we have grapes, so alluding again to the blood of Christ with the wine. But also, when you think about it, the vase represents, with holding water, represents life itself. But the plants are getting life through this water, and we'll see this used as a major motif coming up through the rest of this lecture. Also in San Vitale, we will see the use of what's called protomi capital, which is the part of the capital on the column that shows a carving of a scene. And these are often, again, used to show ideas and concepts from the Bible. And also what's called an impost capital, which is that upside down pyramid shape that's connecting the column up to the arches above. And these are often heavily carved, like you can see here, to create this kind of lacy look. So the idea was to make the column or the capitals look very delicate so that the roof then feels weightless. So if you think of that golden roof that is supposed to symbolize heaven, they're trying to make the roof feel like it's divine gravity, that it is actually heaven, by using these kinds of, delicate carvings to support all that weight. But again, it's quite strong actually. So we'll see these impost capitals being used throughout this period. This is the ceremonial chair of St. Peter's Basilica. And many basilica and cathedra have a special chair that represents sometimes the saint who is the cathedral's in honor of. And if you remember, that Roman word for chair is cathedra. This is where the name cathedral comes from in the first place. This particular chair is the cathedra of St. Peter's Basilica. So the St. Peter's in Rome, and it's a symbol of the Pope. So it's an oaken chair with metal rings on the side. And this is used, people will put poles through that to make it into a sedan. And if you remember, the Romans used sedans to carry people through a crowd. And that's how it was traditionally used, was to carry the Pope through the crowd. This was made from oak, and notice the back of the chair is looking like architecture. So we have the pediment top, the oculuses, those round windows, and then the arcaded panel that series of columns and arches that creates an arcade. These are all typical details of this time in furniture as well. This chair was, of course, very beautifully decorated with inset panels in ivory as well that shows scenes of Christ with Peter. So again, this is the ceremonial chair of St. Peter's. The early churches and also the beautiful mosques that we're going to see in a minute all use what's called a polycandelon to illuminate the interior. So this is basically a chandelier made from bronze typically, and with these glass cups that are filled with oil, and these are suspended in the sanctuary to illuminate the sanctuary in the evening, and even sometimes during the day if it's certain times of the year. But if you can think about then all that oil burning, this is what has caused some of the old mosaics and decorative finishes in the church to get quite covered in kind of a gummy soot, that along with the use of incense that's burned for ceremonies as well. And so this is something that is a problem that needs to be addressed. You know, a lot of the mosaics have been restored because of the use of the oil in the polycandelon. Okay, so I'd already talked about that Byzas in 667 BC established his kingdom here, Byzantium, in what is now modern-day Istanbul. So if you look on the map to the right, you'll see Istanbul on that land bridge that connects Europe and Asia. This area was seized by the Romans in 196 AD. Again, then Emperor Constantine made it his power base, where it became Constantinople. And it was still a Greek hub of culture, and it became a hub of Greek Orthodox Christianity. So it stayed a powerful place for about 1,000 years under that kind of mode, holding on to kind of the Greek and Roman design features and customs and building. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul, which it, of course, has stayed that same name today. Emperor Justinian is reputed to have built more than 30 churches in Constantinople alone, all of which were destroyed over the centuries. But one of his greatest churches, Sophia, which means Holy Wisdom, still stands. And some people have pronounced it Hagia Sophia, but actually is Hagia Sophia. It's the site of a previous Basilica church which had burned down, and this created an opportunity to build this really monumental building. And it was designed by two Greek scientists, mathematicians, Isidoros and Anthemios. And one of the quotes by Isidoros is that architecture is geometry made solid. So Justinian sought to have this church that was so grand that he would outdo Solomon's temple. And when he saw the end result, that he was reported to have said, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." The domed sanctuary of Hagia Sophia was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, and the central dome is supported by 40 arched windows, and we'll take a look at what that looks like from the interior here in a second, but you can see that on this slide. Notice it's surrounded now by 4 minarets, which were added after the Ottoman Turks took this area over. When we look at the dome of Hagia Sophia, the architecture is notable for the use of pendentives, and that's those triangular pieces that are connecting the dome, or basically the sphere of the dome, and transferring the weight of that down to the sides of the building. Those triangular supports, where you can now see archangels painted, is what helps transfer the weight of the dome down to the sides and down into the ground. And the pendentives also, again, created an opportunity to create these winged angels called seraphim. And the dome itself was creating the heavenly realm. So the golden mosaics are representing heavenly light as divine presence, And so the whole theme of the building is, once again, the unity of heaven and earth. We've seen that, for so many different cultures. So we'll see this mixture of this kind of divine weightlessness and then earthly motifs combined. Part of the reason why Hagia Sophia has been able to stay aloft since 563 AD, so more than 1,500 years, is that it's through the use of this kind of crushed brick and mortar. So they took old brick from the Roman works and crushed it up and added brick, lime, water, and sand to create a very light masonry. And it was thought that this lighter brick was what was the key to helping it not collapse. But in fact, the first dome did collapse. And then they built a second dome, and this second dome has survived since 563 all the way to 2020. So it was a church from 537 to 1453, a mosque from 1453 to the 1930s, and then it became a museum. This mortar between the brick is filled with volcanic ash, and that has been a kind of a key to helping the brick be more weightless, and also the brick is fired at lower temperatures, so that also creates less density. It's estimated that it took about 10,000 workers to build this cathedral, and like I said, it's been a museum since 1935, but it remained the largest cathedral for about 1,000 years until the cathedral in Seville, Spain, eclipsed it in size. When you look at the floor plan of the building, you can see the immense size, that it's about 230 feet by 250 feet, just in the main sanctuary. And then the Great Dome rises over 100 feet in diameter, floating above that central rectangle. So it's immense in size. Notice also we have the narthex, which are these outer porches that, again, create a place for people to have a portal to go into a sacred space, meaning they're leaving your outside mindset and your outside world behind and switching your mind into this spiritual place. Notice then again the apse at the focal point of the building, that is now the mihrab, which is the prayer niche. So again, after it became a mosque, different things were converted to make it so. And we'll talk more about what a mihrab is in a minute. Note the fact that they're still using Greek classical motifs in the adornment of Hagia Sophia. So we see the Greek key and some of the leaf and dart borders and so forth that were used since antiquity. There's also the use of the impost capitals, which are creating that sense of weightlessness and that theme of heaven and earth. So again, the lower part of the sanctuary would be earth, and then it lifts up into that golden ceiling with all those Byzantine mosaics in gold for the theme of heaven. Here's a detail of the seraphim, those fiery angels that have 6 wings that are helping support the dome visually. And then also notice the Islamic calligraphy in these medallions. So this is what I mean by the fact that there's it's an unusual building because there's iconography both from Christian belief systems and also the Islamic belief systems in one building, which is quite unique. This mosaic of Archangel Gabriel gives you a closer look at the Byzantine style of mosaics. So again, during the Greek and Roman times, the pieces during the Greek times were about 1/2-inch squares. During Roman times, they did become much more tiny and detailed, but even more so during this time. So they were also using ground gold cast in glass to create tessera. So it's like glass backed with gold leaf or silver leaf. And this extensive use of the gold leaf creates this kind of sparkling illumination in the Byzantine mosaics that were a symbol of divinity. The other thing that is notable is if both eyes were visible in the mosaic, then that was thought to be that being was present in the room. So we'll see some of the beings in more profile, and then some, again, like this one, where both eyes are present or looking forward. So this is that same mosaic, now just windowed back, so you can see what it looks like more from a distance. The scenes also give us a clue about Byzantine style furniture. So notice the difros, the four-legged stool with the footrest, done with wood and inlaid with precious materials such as gold and semi-precious stones for that decorative effect. In this case, to create a throne for the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. It was common in the Byzantine mosaics to give Christ this kind of stern expression on his face, and there's lots of mosaics with Christ as the Pantocrator. I always have a hard time saying that word, Pantocrator, ruler of all. Notice the very fine detail contours of the hand and the face, and just showing again the mastery of the mosaic art form through that detail. Here you get a sense of the enormous scale of the building. If you look at the people on the floor compared to the height of the walls, you can see how massive it really is. And also note the use of the polycandelon. Then we have the mihrab, which is again that prayer niche in the apse. And then notice the use of the marble columns and the impost capitals with the arcades. Then we see the marble insets on the wall. Again, the marble imported from different places in the world, and all combined together to create this very powerful effect. After the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople and turned it into Istanbul, new decorative details were added to the sanctuary, such as Iznik tiles, which were produced in now what is modern-day Turkey, in these beautiful patterns and colors. And we'll talk more about Iznik coming up in a minute, but these are just later additions to Hagia Sophia. Other additions included these pierced lattice work called mushrabia. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail, but this was also like the Indian Jali screen, which helps create privacy, light filtering effects, decorative patterns, and so forth. A material that was commonly used in Byzantine times was ivory, and they would use all different types of ivory: elephant ivory, walrus, pig and boar teeth, even whale teeth and teeth of hippopotamus. But this particular piece is carved from elephant ivory, unfortunately. This, of course, was before elephants became endangered. But ivory carving was, again, a big part of Byzantine design, so we need to talk about it. This is the bishop's throne or cathedra for Maximum, the Archbishop of Ravenna. And it shows ivory plaques carved with a whole bunch of intricate detail. Every square inch is very intricately carved with birds and animals and biblical scenes. But those front panels are showing John the Baptist in the center with the four evangelists on either side of him. And again, this is the cathedra, or that ceremonial chair for Maximum. Note the peacocks on the carving as another symbol that we see used in many, many cultures. Like we've seen in other time periods, very little of the original furniture has survived, so we know about it more from these kinds of carvings. That throne of Maximum is unusual, and because it was covered in ivory, the wood rotted away, but the ivory panels survived, so that's how they were able to reconstruct the chair. But notice they're using these very straight-sided chairs, again with decorative inlays, and when it's a throne situation, it usually has a footstool. And then the furniture is also covered in a very padded cushion that typically, if it was for a wealthier person, would be made from some kind of a fine textile perhaps a silk imported from India or China. And for a more humble person, which who wouldn't be sitting on a throne, but they would use cushions also with more humble fabrics like wool. Here we see one of the most ornate Byzantine churches in Europe is St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, or San Marco, and it's known for its beautiful Byzantine interior. But it's located on the famous Piazza San Marco, right off Venice's Grand Canal, and it's a Basilica church that started in this location in 864 to hold the body of St. Mark. We'll talk about the story of how the body got to Venice, Italy, but the church that you see it now in this state was begun in 1063 and finished around 1085. So there were different additions to it over those years. So the church is in basically the plan of a Greek cross, where the vertical and horizontal members are the same length. So in this case, it would be the nave, stretching usually from west to east up toward the apse, which would be the vertical part of the cross, and then the transept, which goes north-south, which would be the horizontal part of the cross. Many churches, Catholic churches, are made in the shape of a Latin cross, where the nave is longer than the transept, but San Marcos is in a Greek cross style. This is the Cathedral of San Marcos, or the chair again, the ceremonial chair for St. Mark. And San Marcos has become again this symbol of Venetian wealth and power, but there's a bit of a story of how that became so. What happened is Venetian merchants paid some pirates to sail to Alexandria, Egypt, to steal the remains of St. Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria, from the Coptics, the Christians that lived there. And they wanted to build this church to house his remains and other holy relics. So they also stole this throne, which is interesting because this is also called the Gnostic throne of Alexandria. And they believe it, again, was St. Mark's chair. In fact, it's carved from gypsum. It has Hebrew writing on the chair. The way they smuggled it out of Alexandria, that area was controlled by Muslims at the time. They packed the body and the chair in the hull of the ship, and then they put pork all over it so that the Muslims wouldn't want to look beneath the pork to see what else they had in the hull of the ship. And this is how they said they were smuggling the body and the throne to Venice, where it still resides to this day. Now you might wonder why people go to these kinds of extremes to bring a holy relic to their town. Well, there's religious reasons, of course, but there's also economic reasons. And notice it was the merchants who had the body stolen, or paid the pirates to have the body stolen. If you had a holy relic, that attracted pilgrims to your town. And the more pilgrims came to the town, of course, the better for business, because they needed places to stay, things to eat, things to buy, and so forth. So will be many cases, as you can see, of people trying to create. Also, different towns were in competition for each other to create the grandest cathedral to attract pilgrims also. So we'll see this in this whole time period as these churches are being built as a destination point. And then also, Venice itself, of course, is a hub of trade. So we'll see these influences coming in from what was the Eastern Roman Empire in through Venice, and through a lot of influence of Middle Eastern design and Asian, and a lot of wealth coming into Venice for that reason too. So it became a very powerful city-state. So now, hopefully now that I've laid the groundwork of why the cathedral was built in this style and in this fashion, you can see the beautiful Byzantine mosaics supporting the dome here as well, with use of the gold tesseract and the angel figures again, relating the dome of the sanctuary to heaven. And I don't know if you've ever had a chance to go to San Marcos, but I have, and it is very amazing. Just takes your breath away. I actually broke down crying looking at it because it was so beautiful. But that's not unusual for me, but it really is spectacular. I hope you do get a chance to see it sometime. Um, anyway, so this again was another example of Byzantine mosaic style here in Venice, Italy. You also see those Byzantine style mosaics and lunettes, or that half circle over the door. And then notice the different layers of the marble columns and the different layers of carved molding that create this, again, feeling of passage from the outer world into the inner world of the spirit. You can see the golden lion of St. Mark up on the facade of the church here. And then also notice the more decorative, almost like frosting on the cake at the top. Those are Gothic spires and additions that were later additions. Remember I said the building was embellished over the years from the earlier form to this form that it's in today, where it's kind of a composite of Byzantine and Gothic on the outside and pure Byzantine on the inside. Another notable detail of the facade are these bronze horses from antiquity called a quadringa. Quadringa, so it's Quadringa, quadringa. These were originally pulling a chariot, and this was stolen from Constantinople during the Crusades of 1204. So this was a Roman statue cast in bronze that would have been 4 horses pulling a figure in a chariot. And again, this was taken as some of the wealth that they brought back from the Crusades to their city. So this now has become one of the symbols of San Marcos Cathedral, the quadringa. Up at the altar of San Marcos is what's called the Pala d'Oro, which is the reliquary for San Marcos. And then these little niches hold sacred items. And so again, these churches were designed for pilgrims to be able to visit and circulate through and be able to visit these sacred items. The Pala d'Oro is an example of an iconostasis screen that divides the altar from the main body of the church. So you can see that there on the eastern end. Notice the west is the entrance to the church typically, and then the altar is facing east. And again, if you remember that thought of rebirth, it's facing the rising sun. This cloisonite icon in the Byzantine style from the treasury is just an example of the beautiful detail and the artistry of taking the human form and stylizing it in this fashion. They do show some depth with the hands and the hand wrapping around the staff and so forth. But notice the use of repose also to create the dimensional effects in the hair and the face, and then the inlay of the different semi-precious stones like amethyst and so forth to create this beautiful relic. Another thing to mention here was that in the year 726 AD, Byzantine Emperor Leo III ordered the icon of Christ over the door of the imperial palace be destroyed. He had not lost his faith, but he had joined a pious group that believed that showing Christ was not allowed, that Christ was too holy to be pictured. And this is called iconoclasm, or image breaking. This lasted for over a century, and we'll also see the use of iconoclasm in Islamic, in certain sects of Islam. But in this case, in the Byzantine time, it was resulted in the ban on production of icons and even very bad punishment for anyone who made one. So a lot of times this caused some of the craftsmen then to leave Constantinople and go to other places, such as Asia, where we saw the spread of cloisonné and that art form, in Asia after the people started to leave Constantinople, the artisans. When you look at this mosaic of St. Mark, you also see that there's a decline in some of the understanding that the Romans had in perspective. So notice how the one leg of the bed is turning out at a 45-degree angle instead of staying vertical. And then the top line where the columns are is out of perspective as well. So this not only shows us information about the kind of lectus, or that same kind of daybed that the Romans would have used that was still in use during this Byzantine era, but the fact that, again, some of the knowledge in art has declined. Some of the Byzantine furniture, as you can see, most of it's been reused from the Roman times, such as the cathedra, those chairs, the cella, the four-legged stool, the cella curilius, the X stool that folds. And these would have had thick cushions, like I said, sometimes made of silk, and you can see people sitting on those thick cushions in this illustration. They also used cupboards with painted designs and what's called a lectern, which is this kind of podium thing where it can support a book on it. And this was designed for monks who were copying classical texts and making copies of those called illuminated manuscripts. So you can see they're holding the original text on that lectern, and then they're using the new text on their lap to transcribe, the things they're reading from those old text books. And then they're also creating beautiful illustrations using plant-based dyes in the books as well. So we'll see more of one of the illuminated manuscripts on the next slide. The beds used during this time were similar to the Roman lectus, but they were typically made from 4 posts, and there was woven ropes to support the mattress. So you can't see the mattress or the woven ropes here, but those ropes would support, then a mattress would be stuffed with wool or other types of cloth. And in this case, of course, they're showing a ceremonial scene. So the textiles are very fine on the bed, where for most people the textiles would be something much simpler and more humble. So all during this time period, pilgrims were traveling to different holy sites to, visit things that they were venerating or worshiping. And that never changed, but Pope Urban II wanted to regain access to some of the major holy sites that were then controlled by the Muslims, and he promised forgiveness of all sins if the person were to go on this holy crusade. So this had a huge consequence for society. At this time, there were many knights and feudalism that were under the guidance or the leadership of a certain lord or a landowner. And a lot of these people, including the landowners, left. A lot of the men left to go on these crusades. So they were, again, armies of Christians, soldiers from Western Europe primarily, on this plea from Urban II, left for the Middle East. And they did capture Jerusalem in 1099, but through deteriorating alliances, they, it wasn't a success. They had another series of crusades that culminated in the sack of Constantinople in 1201, and they were driven out of that area by 1291. So again, this was a series of events that went from 1095 to 1291, but the reason they're important to world history is that, like I said, all of these men left the home front, so that left women at the home front, and that gained them more power. They were all of a sudden the decision makers. This also destabilized society in that many of the peasants or the serfs that were working on the land left and moved to town. They didn't have to stay there with the lord lording over them. This also started to centralize powers of monarchs, though, to try to bring stable economies in that power vacuum with all of the soldiers and the knights and so forth out on crusade. The way that it affects our discussion is that the Crusaders brought back Greek classical ideals from the Byzantine Empire, which helped spark the Renaissance. And they also brought back building forms from the Muslims, such as the pointed arch, that is going to have a huge impact to things like Gothic cathedrals, which we'll talk about in more detail coming up. One of the sites they wanted access to is this site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which means tomb. It was venerated as a site of Christ's crucifixion and burial. And Hadrian had actually had a temple built here for Venus to help suppress the Christian worship and to bury the cave in the 2nd AD. But then Constantine, remember the Christian emperor, ordered the temple to be replaced by a Christian church in 325. And he put his mother in charge of this project. So this is the church that was built in Byzantine design. And this church actually influenced many other church designs back in Europe when the Crusaders came back home. They brought some of the impression from this church with them. In the top of the church, in the dome, you see the image of Christ Pantocrator. That you can see the inset here on this particular slide. But what's also significant is the bell tower. So remember how I said they would do processionals during this time, similar to how the Athenians would do processionals around the Parthenon instead of going into the building to worship. In this case, the priests would lead processionals out from the bell tower and around the church. And so the bell tower then becomes synonymous with this Church of the Holy Sepulchre and causes more bell towers to be built for churches back in the West, or back in Europe again as well. One of the churches that was inspired by the Crusades is Temple Church in London. Was originally designed from the Knights Templar, who were some of the knights that had taken vows to protect pilgrims en route. So they had initiation ceremonies and they took vows of piety, chastity, poverty, and obedience. And these Templar Knights, again, are what gives the Temple Church its name. So that's named after Solomon's Temple. So after Jerusalem had been captured in 1099, again, the Templar Knights were founded, and they are denoted with that red cross on their chest. Byzantine time design stayed active, I should say, even after the empire's fall in 1453, in that Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible was descended from the last of the Byzantine emperors, and they were continuing to build Byzantine-style buildings in Kiev and Moscow, for example. And a notable one, St. Basil's Cathedral, is one we'll see next. St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow is arguably the most famous Byzantine-style building in that area. It's Russian Byzantine / Nordic style, and this is named for Basil the Blessed, who was a Moscow homeless man and a visionary who's now buried there, and he was made a saint in 1588. So the way the story goes is that he was, the Tsar Ivan the Terrible was trying to celebrate his victories in war, and Ivan in fact had killed thousands. And Basil, a homeless man, would walk the streets with little clothing, just living off alms, and he would just give whatever he had to those in need. So he would rebuke the Tsar. So Ivan was trying to curry favor with him because he was this visionary person. But every gift that Ivan gave Basil, he would give away to someone in need. So when Basil died, Ivan actually helped carry his coffin into the cathedral, and the cathedral was named after him. So this has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1990, and let's take a look at how it appears today. These onion-shaped domes are what you see as part of Byzantine design, and the bright colors were painted in the 17th century to match the biblical description of the colors in heaven. So originally they were just painted white with gold, which you'll see on the next slide, a building like that. But this is what they're famous for now, is this very polychrome effect. But notice the layers of detail, and these what's called helmet domes, where we have these domes rising on that kind of vertical tower. These are other examples of helmet domes. So you can see that dome shape sitting on that vertical tower like a helmet sitting on top of a person's head, right? And so this type of Byzantine style became quite popular in Eastern Orthodox Catholicism, well, Eastern Orthodox religion, I should say, and so became associated with those kinds of churches in Eastern Europe. One reason why Byzantine style was important is it held sway in a broad area of the world for over 1,000 years, influencing everything from Mughal architecture in India to Islamic design, as seen here at the Great Mosque of Damascus. And this is the Umayyad Mosque from 715 AD, one of the largest and oldest in the world, and built on the site where John the Baptist's head is reported to be buried. It's the fourth holiest site in Islam, and you can see that it was built with Byzantine artisans that created the mosaics in this kind of stylized format that you see on the front of the building. And it was used as a prototype for mosques world over. So we'll see examples of these kind of Byzantine style with the use of the gold in things like the Great Mosque of Cordoba, for example, in Al-Andalus in a couple classes from now. But again, notice those flattened and stylized forms that we saw in the Byzantine mosaics being utilized here on the front of this design. When we talk about Islamic design, it's not strictly tied to a certain region or time period like other things we've been talking about. And it really covers all aspects of life, from buildings, interiors, and decorative elements. And so it's a product of a cultural group, followers of Muhammad or in the Muslims that are found, in many different parts of the world, and therefore different world designs, like we saw the Great Mosque of Genet last class, will be incorporated within that religious iconography. So when we talk about Islam, it's a ancient religion also, and started with the birth of Muhammad in 570, and then he died in 632, and he was able to unite the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula under a new religion, and they began military conquest within a few years after their prophet's death. So this extended the new faith's religion, or that influence, throughout the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, India, and Central Asia. And great cities were built under these Islamic rulers, or rebuilt, I should say, too, or added onto cities such as Cairo, Baghdad, Cordoba in what is now Spain, and great universities were established during this time. There's two major sects in the Islamic religion, the Sunni and the Shia. About 85% you can see are Sunni. And this had to do with how after Muhammad passed, would there be either elected leadership or leadership via direct heirs. So you can see the different sects split from that. But there's also Sufism, and there's Muslim mystics who were, you can see, prominent in Persia and India, that emerged from the Shia sect, but also integrated in some Sunni sects. Their name is from the word suf, which is a garment of coarse wool. And one of their famous quotes is that God is beautiful and loves beauty. So they were craftspeople often that sought artistic beauty, and that artistic beauty was a reflection of inner beauty. Their art, therefore, is allegorical and symbolic, with rich layers of religious references. And then you see a Kufic script here, which is saying, "Be blessed, Muhammad." So I'm not going to wade too deep into all these waters, but just the main bottom line is they tend to be more iconoclastic, meaning they're not going to show an image of Muhammad. They usually represent these kind of allegorical or symbolic things via geometry or stylized plant motifs and those kinds of attributes that depict these religious principles. So Islam was started by Muhammad, who is a native of Mecca, and Islam means submission to God. And so it was founded in 622 AD, but oppositions to his teachings there led Muhammad to immigrate to Medina, about 200 miles away, where he continued to preach, and he also built the first mosque next to his house, which is the second holiest site of Islam. And in Islam, the 5 tenets are: first, a profession of faith; 2, charity to the poor; 3, daytime fasting during Ramadan; 4, at least 1 pilgrimage to Mecca in one's lifetime; and 5, to pray towards Mecca 5 times per day. So we'll see more about that on the next slide. When Muslims are praying toward Mecca 5 times a day, they're facing this site, and this is the Kaaba, or the cube. And pilgrims come here to circle the Kaaba, also in a counterclockwise direction, 7 times. Underneath this black and gold cloth is a home made from stone called Abraham's house, or Allah's house. It's the holiest site in the Islamic faith. It's been here for 14 centuries, and there's a black granite, or black, actually obsidian stone in the eastern part of the Kaaba that's called the Black Stone. And it's likely a meteorite, but it's very holy to Muslims. It was said it was found by Abraham from the time of Adam and Eve, and it's on the cornerstone of the building. So the stone was set in this location in 605 AD. It was said it was given to Abraham by Archangel Gabriel. And so again, when people are going around, they seek to connect to the Black Stone. So no matter where in the world Islamic architecture is being created, it tends to follow certain principles. Whether it be a mosque, a tomb, a palace, or a fort, there's these kind of vocabulary or pieces of Islamic architecture that tend to be repeated. And some of the pieces have origins dating back to the Romans and Byzantine and even Persian architecture. But some things to look for are ordered repetition. So notice how the pattern repeats all over. Notice the ordered repetition of the top band of the building. And then the balance and the radiating structure. So we've got that center point of the dome radiating out symmetrically from that center point. And in this case, all 4 facades of the building are identical and have that symmetry. There's rhythmic motif and metric patterns. So notice the arches with the vertical lines between them on the top band of the designs again. There tends to be columns with niches and pointed arches. And again, this overall sense of balance and cosmic order. And there's this also idea of fractal geometry, meaning taking a design and then repeating it out many times. So we will see all of these being used in Islamic design. You can see other examples of fractal geometry in this slide. A fractal is a never-ending pattern, and they're infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. So depending on how large it is, they're still repeating over and over in an ongoing kind of feedback loop. And they're very dynamic for that reason. So we see that in Islamic design patterning. You can see here that in a relatively short period of time, from the time of Muhammad, the Muslim faith spread quite quickly through the Arabian Peninsula, in through Egypt and North Africa, through the Middle East, and then all the way up into what was then called Al-Andalus, or the peninsula of Spain and Portugal, or Iberia, and then all the way over into, bordering on India during these time periods. Another significant structure for Islam, but it's also a significant location for people of the Jewish and Christian faith as well, is the Dome of the Rock, built here in Jerusalem in 691 and patterned after that Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's an octagonal plan, which was influenced by Byzantine chapel of St. Mary's that had been in the area. And on this location, it was thought for the Muslims that Muhammad ascended to heaven to visit God on his night journey to heaven. For Jews and Christians, it was the site of the Temple of Solomon and the rock where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac, which is also significant to Muslims. It was the site of a Roman temple for Jupiter at one point, and also a Byzantine Christian church. So again, a site that's remained actively important for many faiths. This was one of the sites that the Crusaders wanted to capture in Jerusalem, and the Knights Templar believed it was the site again of the Temple of Solomon. So it's featured on the seals of their orders, and it became a model for some of the churches in Europe as well. The Dome of the Rock is actually constructed out of wood, unlike Hagia Sophia, which we saw, which was made out of masonry or ground cement. This was then painted gold. So when we look on the interior, you can see that significant rock. And then on the outside, we have what's called Islamic tiles. So let's take a look at those. Look at the blue and gold colors, which represent, again, the blue representing sky and infinity, the gold, the knowledge of God. And these tiles, there's about 45,000 of them, were installed under the rule of Suleiman or Suleiman I in the 1500s. And the other notable thing here are those pointed arches in front of the facade. So it's thought that the Crusaders might have seen these pointed arches in this location and brought that knowledge back into Europe again to help create the Gothic cathedrals. Another significant structure in Istanbul, besides Hagia Sophia, is Slimani Mosque, and it's in Istanbul. It was built from 1550 to 1557 by the Emperor of the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the architect Mimar Sinan, who is a very notable architect of the day. It blends both Islamic and Byzantine elements, so again, inspired by Hagia Sophia, and you can see the beautiful minarets. So those towers are where people are called 5 times a day to pray toward Mecca. That's those tall towers. Now they typically have a recording, but back in this day they would have had people chanting to call the prayer. And let's take a look on the interior. We'll talk more about Sinan, the amazing Islamic architect, in our discussion on the Renaissance. At this point, the Ottoman Empire was going through a Renaissance, and Sinan was responsible for building many beautiful structures, about 400 structures during this classical period. And he lived to be 97 years old, so he had a long reach here, but this is one of his masterpieces, and you can see this incredible polycandelon along with the banded arches. They're using the same ideas from Hagia Sophia of the dome, supported by the pendentives, those triangular shaped supports that transfers the load of the dome down to the outer walls of the mosque in this case. Excuse me. And the dome is further supported by these half domes you can see on either end, which is called a tympanum. And then the dome here is 85 feet in diameter. So when we look at a mosque, it's a complex that usually includes a madrasa or school, a library, sometimes a hospital, and then notice the geometric and calligraphy design patterns. And again, this is from the classical period of the Ottoman Empire. Note the use of the alternating colors of the red and limestone. And this is a feature of Islamic architecture called a block. It means piebald. And it's derived from a Byzantine style that was used in Hagia Sophia with these alternating courses of either ashlar stone and brick. but it became associated with Southern Syrian design from the Umayyad Mosque when it was repaired in the 12th century. And so it was used earlier than that, but this is when it became associated with Southern Syrian design and specifically the area around Damascus. So it has now become a feature of Islamic architecture. We'll see it being used in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and it was used in the Dome of the Rock. So it was also thought to have to do with the stone supply, that there was an equal amount available of black limestone and white limestone. So you'll often see these banded arches in black and white patterns as a staple, again, of Islamic architecture. Mosques have an open area for people to pray towards Mecca, and then they have the mihrab, which is the prayer niche, which orients the faithful towards Mecca, so they know which direction to pray. And then there's also a minbar, which is a pulpit, which usually is adjacent to the mihrab, which is a place where on Fridays they would deliver a sermon. And there's usually a water basin nearby where people could ritually wash before their prayers. And now we see the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, built in 1616 and fondly called the Blue Mosque. And it's in Ottoman style with Sunni Islam design. And it was built on the ruins of a Byzantine palace in front of Hagia Sophia. So this is also in Istanbul. There's 5 domes and 6 minarets, incorporating Byzantine and Islamic influences. And it's also known for having beautiful tile work. So we'll take a look on the interior of that next. So this was built under the leadership of Ahmed I, who ruled and it was built from 1609 to 1616. And there's about 20,000 handmade ceramic tiles with 50 different tulip patterns on these domes and semi-domes that are illuminated with 14 windows. The full dome has about 28 windows. And the tulip design is notable because people often associate tulips with the Netherlands when in fact they're from Turkey, from this area. So they were imported into Europe from this area, but this is where they were originally grown. So we'll see quite a few tulip designs in Islamic art. When you see those gold pointed figures attaching from the center point of the niche and kind of cascading down to the outer walls, those are called merquana. And we will be discussing more about how the different forms merquana come in on subsequent slides. But just a notable detail from the mihrab of the Blue Mosque, or the Ahmed Mosque. Another popular motif in Islamic architecture is the horseshoe arch. This actually was first seen in Visigothic Spain. It was used by the Visigoths in some of their early churches, and again we'll see that in a few classes from now. But it was used by the Persians and the Byzantines very early on too, in about the 5th century. And so it was thought perhaps when the Moors invaded Spain, the Islamic forces invaded Spain in 711, and some of these arch shapes, came into that area with them. But in fact, these Visigothic churches in Spain are from the 5th century. So again, it's one of those things where maybe the same form emerged in 2 different locations. In any event, the horseshoe arch shape became more exaggerated over the centuries, like you see here. So you can see that big curve past vertical in the shape of a horseshoe. Here's the Topkapi Palace that was home to the Ottoman sultans for about 400 years. And it's located on the Golden Horn, which is that inlet off the Bosphorus in Istanbul. And it's now a museum for Muslim holy relics. But again, it was a palace for 400 years, from about 1400 to 1800s. And it's huge. About 4,000 people lived here. So it's got 4 main courtyards. And let's take a closer look. The palace has 3 main courtyards that tend to go into more increasing privacy. where the inner sanctum was for only the Sultan and his family and the most honored guests. So it goes from, that outer courtyard to the innermost courtyard and a royal audience hall. So when we saw that also in things like the Forbidden City in China, that same idea of going from the outer area to the inner sanctum. Notice in the Sultan's inner salon, there's the use of the diwan, which is, if you've ever heard the word divan as a sofa, that's where it derives from this Turkish word divan, which is a built-in platform for sitting or sleeping around the perimeter of the room. It's also called a sufa in Arabic, which is the origin for the word sofa. So we have a sofa or sufa, which becomes sofa, and a diwan, which becomes divan. It's kind of, more people in the South would call it a divan. Again, it's that word for sofa. But this is an imperial hall throne room. And again, it's also part of the harem, which is the women's quarters for the women and the children. And you can see again that seating. And then the main freestanding seat would have been for the Sultan to sit in with a canopy over it. In this area of the palace, you also see those vase of life motifs. So remember that showing that life-giving effect of water, right? That the flowers have to grow in water. And when we look on the next slide, you'll see some of the main design elements, which are an arabesque, the stained glass, and these kind of influence of Silk Road cultures on the designs as well. Here's another look at one of the diwan, or those built-in seating platforms that are cushioned. And then back in the day, they would have had also more silk cushions and fine textiles, and those kinds of things laid on the diwan too for more comfort. We also see this iconic blue, which is called Persian cobalt. Cobalt is a mineral that, when put into the glazes of ceramics, creates this beautiful deep blue. And so this was another trade item, and we'll see this influencing Asian pottery in the Ming Dynasty era with the blue and white china. These are other two commonly used details in Islamic architecture. One is a mushrabiyah, which is a pierced screen effect, and that allows privacy and heat control. But also we have what's called an oriel window. So that's this protrusion off the second floor of the building that allows more floor space off the building. But they're typically, again, surrounded with these mushrabiyah or these pierced screen work. So this was often a common spot to store their water. This kept the water cooler in this kind of shaded location. It was also a way that people could maintain privacy, so they could look down into the street without having people be able to observe them. This is also a detail that will come back into Europe through the Crusades. We'll see oriel windows commonly used during the medieval times as things what we call jetties on medieval buildings. I myself love the dimension of light and shadow that are created from the mushrabiyah. So you can see that beautiful light pattern that comes in through those ornamental screens. And that creates a whole nother dimension in the space. A private residence might look somewhat unassuming from the street, but inside there was a very rich world around a courtyard, or sometimes up to 4 courtyards, each featuring fountains, fruit trees, and flowers. And the main rooms opened onto this courtyard. Also at the entrance, you'd often see a small marble fountain like you can see here. And then that led to this raised floor area called a tazar, which is an area for host and honored guest. And the host or the honored guest would be seated next to the host on the most cushions to be raised highest off the floor. And notice the very high ceilings in the space as well, up to 22 feet often. And then you can see the use of the mushrabiyah, which are the pierced areas too, and of course the beautifully decorative floor in this case. So these private residences had a whole beautiful world, and they still do here in the Middle East. A lot of you know, decorative things happening behind a rather plain facade. Another grand Islamic structure in Persian style is the Topkapi Palace, which is an imperial palace located in Iran, and it's known for incredible interior details. So it was originally designed as a large portal with 7 floors accessed by a spiral staircase or a great gate, and it shows different floral, animal, and bird motifs. But it's known for its beautiful music room, which we'll look at next. Here we see the music room from the palace, and it's made from stucco, which is a term synonymous for plasterwork, but it's a type of plaster that can be molded while damp and allowed to harden and carve like wood. Because it's relatively cheap, it can be reapplied quickly. And so we'll see some elaborate stucco work coming up when we look at Hispano-Moorish design. But these are merquanas, so they're basically decorative niches, typically made from stucco, but can also be made out of wood. And they create this architectural ornamentation. They were developed in mid-10th century Persia, and again made from brick, stone, or stucco. And they have this tiered effect. So it's a way that there's this kind of jagged, or I wouldn't call jagged, but just kind of stepped design from the apex of the top of the ceiling, sometimes a dome, to the outer walls of the structure. So they can be used in a large way like this music room, or sometimes in a small detail like we saw with the mihrab in the Blue Mosque. But again, this is a merquana. And this particular one has an interesting acoustic value because you've got all these shapes of traditional Persian instruments used to create interesting sound effects for this music room. These are examples of merquana from the Great Mosque of Cordoba that we will again talk about in a few classes. But notice again those stair-stepped or staggered details of coming from the central point of the star and then kind of tearing out to the outer walls of the structure. And then on the next one you see a merquana that's green, that's covered in frit glass or ceramic glaze that's got glass in it to create a very shiny effect. Another incredible use of stucco is what's called yesoria, and it's carved stucco work. We see this in Morocco, and Moroccan artists came up into Spain and brought this technique with them. And what they do is they take wet plaster, they put a stencil on it, and then they start to carve out these different very ornamental layered techniques within the plaster. So we'll talk about this in great depth in a couple classes. As we've already noted, that Islamic design is synonymous with incredible ceramic tile work. And there's 2 different types of Islamic ceramic tile typically. One is the tiles are a interlocking or interesting shape, such as star shape or cross shape, that are meant to be put together in an interesting pattern, or the shape of the tile is just a plain square or rectangle, and there's a complex pattern painted on the tile. But either way, these create complex interlocking geometric shapes that are based on plant forms typically. This is an example of one of those interesting shapes I was talking about, and these would be interlocking with other tiles of shapes, geometric shapes as well. But this is also an example of luster glaze, and these luster glazes were developed in the 9th century. This includes these metallic oxides that produce an iridescent look. So it's basically an overglaze applied to the ceramics that's already been glazed and fired once, and it's commonly used in the Middle East, Egypt, and North Africa, also in Spain. One of the reasons it was thought it was developed is that Islam, people are forbidden to eat off of metal dishes, and so they developed these luster glazes to have a metallic appearance. Here you see an ancient Iranian or Persian art form named minakari, and mina is a glass-like coating of enamel on a metal background, usually copper and or silver, and sometimes gold these days. But it's this brilliant enamel color that's painted on in intricate designs and then fired at a high temperature that's been used in Persia since 1500 BC. And this craft then spread to India. Again, it's a powdered glass-like substance that is painted on, and then it can be painted on usually on metal, but you'll see on the next slide it can also be used on glass or even a ceramic background. You've heard me use this term Iznik a few times, and this is a tile art form that emerged in Turkey between 1530 and 1540 AD, and went on from there. But it's using a stone paste body of clay, which is kind of a very stiff type of clay. So typically they would press this into molds to shape or use as a ceramic tile because it has frit in it or crushed glass. So it's difficult to turn on a wheel. Again, it was easier to put into a mold. They would coat it then with a thin slip of clay, and then the decoration is applied to that slip coating, either freehand or with stencils. And this early example shows the use of cobalt again with this stylized floral motif. And the blue and white was a common color palette. But the other thing that was very common to the Iznik type of design is what's called a hanseri leaf pattern, which are these long serrated leaves. So those leaves that have those jagged edges. And that's a typical pattern for the Iznik tile. Also kind of stylized tulip forms, stylized carnations, hyacinths, violets, and pomegranate type of patterns. And there was a big boom in this type of tile in the mid-16th century. There was a lot of court commissions going on with some of those, where it was like the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of building was going on during this time. But we'll see on the next slides how the Middle Eastern tile affected the Chinese porcelain and how the Chinese porcelain affected Middle Eastern tile on the next couple slides. You've also heard me use this term arabesque, and an arabesque is an interlocking geometric form that typically can have some kind of allusion toward vines of plants. And you can see here with this interlocking line in the pattern that it looks like things are passing either in front or in back. So these kind of geometric feelings of depth created just with the feeling of the foliage patterns. And this is another example of a Iznik tile. Asia and the Middle East have a long history of trade going on back and forth. And we see the Chinese influence on Islamic art with these two bowls. So Chinese pottery from the Tang period, if you'll recall that Tang horse that had the ochre, green and white, was found in Iraq, and also bits of Celadon pottery with Celadon glaze. So it was thought that those were traded to the Persian court or brought as gifts to the Persian court. And then traders on the Silk Road again were bringing Islamic art into Asia as well. And the other thing they were bringing is what's called Persian cobalt, which is a mineral that creates this brilliant blue. One thing that they were trading back and forth is also motifs. So we see these grape motifs from China being reinterpreted with the Iznik stone paste ceramics here in the 16th century. This was happening during the Ming Dynasty in China. So again, if there was this return of native rule over China, and this was a peak in ceramics production, also in other things like lacquer work and textile as well. But the motifs then had a inspiration with Islamic design. So again, the things going from the Middle East to China influenced the Ming Dynasty artisans, and then the Ming Dynasty artisans were influencing what was going on with ceramic work in the Middle East and in the West. So this porcelain, like we saw with Chinese, it has that kaolin in it, so it's true porcelain, but it also had the cobalt oxides, again coming in from Persia, which at the time was valued twice its weight in gold. And it was also known as, you can see on the slide, Islamic blue. So again, you see a Ming era vase on the left, inspiring the Italian Basilica blue and white vase on the right. The Chinese blue and white porcelain, again, once fired, could be decorated with refined cobalt, again called Islamic blue, applied with water and a brush, and then coated with the clear glaze and fired at a high temperature. And this was shunned for a time in the Chinese court as being too foreign. So again, this was really thought to be more of a Middle Eastern design motif, ironically, but now we associate it with China. So during the 17th century, they were exporting a lot of this China to Europe, and then that influenced things like Delft ware in the Netherlands and Basilica, among other things. Another beautiful art form from the Middle East is Damascening, named after Damascus, Syria. And if you'll remember, the Assyrians were wonderful metal workers from way back in the beginning of Mesopotamia. But it's the art of inlaying different metals one into another. So in this case, we've got silver inlaid into brass, or sometimes oxidized steel. Mosul is an important center of this type of art. So we'll see a few other examples on the next slides. But again, it's taking gold or silver and inlaying it into either oxidized steel or brass. Here's a beautiful example of Damascening, where again the form is decorated by using thin gold or silver wires that are inserted into tiny grooves that have been cut into the surface of the base metal. And the grooves form decorative patterns, and then that other thin metal becomes highlighted on that background. So it's most often applied to steel objects, but it also can be used on iron, copper, or brass. And the inlays can be gold or silver, and sometimes even this type of silver compound with a black appearance. Of course, an important art form for the Islamic world are textiles, woven textiles, which has been a tradition going back to Mesopotamia. Women were trained as young girls to spin and weave, and men often would take charge of the dyeing, selling of the textiles. And of course, through the Silk Road, exporting textiles became an important part of the economy. So silks were used that were woven in this case, a Turkish cushion cover. And different words that we use in textiles actually are Arabic in origin. So English words we use now, such as blouse, chiffon, cotton, damask, muslin, and satin are all Arabic in origin. There is a wide range of textile qualities, from very basic cloth to very rich and complex designs like you see here. And, for very simple use, and then also things for religious or royal use. You see in this textile the same stylized flower patterns that we see in the Eastnic tiles. So notice the stylized tulips and the Hanseri leaf patterns. One of the traditional dyeing techniques is ikat, which is dyeing using to create these kinds of patterns, and it employs resist dyeing on the yarn prior to the dyeing. So what they do is they form bundles of individual yarns, and then they tightly wrap in desired patterns, and then the yarns are dyed. So it creates this kind of almost kind of a blurry look on the edges. The term ikat is Indonesian in origin, but this process is here being used in the Middle East. Rugs have been an important mainstay in Islamic design and used as floors for nomadic tribesmen as a sign of wealth, and also hung on the inside faces of tents to help keep sun and sand and things out of the tent for nomadic tribesmen. Also for prayer rugs, because of course they kneel and pray towards Mecca 5 times per day. The evidence of woven pile rugs dates all the way back to 2000 BC in this area, and woven rugs from Persia were written about in China from the 6th century AD. So again, it's an ancient tradition in rug weaving in this area. Typically, the rugs with more curvilinear patterns have a higher knot content, and they're more complex, and they have up to 500 knots per inch. So we'll talk more about the different styles of knots on the next couple slides. Because fine carpets came in from the West, from China, Persia, and Turkey, sometimes the name will be given to them as Oriental rugs. In fact, the preferred name now is Islamic carpet, and it's because there's different types of rugs coming from different areas, so it's not really proper anymore to just call them that Persian rug, because they might not be from Persia. In fact, there's different techniques used on either side of that red dotted line approximately. So we have what's called the Turkish knot being used on the west side of that line, and the Persian knot being used on the east side of that line. So if you'll see on the bottom, you can see a diagram of the Turkish knot where the 2 threads kind of wrap in and up, and then the Persian knot where they kind of go in a continuous direction. But again, these rugs can have up to 500 knots per inch. So if you can just imagine sitting at a loom and trying to tie 500 tiny little knots in 1 square inch, you'll know how complex these patterns can be. The designs of Islamic carpets are endless, and there's very many different types of patterns associated with different tribal rugs, and there's different patterns associated with different geographic parts of the Islamic world. But some of the common patterns going from left to right on the pink and green carpet on the left is the Gul pattern, G-U-L, which is a geometric emblem that in Persian means rose or flower. And it would be that center medallion. So it's usually an octagon, hexagonal shape, or a diamond. And many nomadic tribes have their own signature one. The next rug over, you can see the tree of life motif that we've seen used in many cultures, again to represent that life repeating itself. But notice it's very stylized with that vertical line and then the stylized leaves coming off on either side of that. The next one over, we have the vase of immortality. So notice how it looks like a tree of life, but the flowers are emerging from a vase. And of course, living in a hot climate, water is a precious resource. So this is showing the life-giving force of the water, with the plants coming out of the vase. And then on the last example to the right, we have a Haradi border, which is a floral border, usually within a curve or diamond shape. And it's the word for fish. It usually has serrated leaves within the pattern, and they are said to be stylized acanthus leaves. So again, this is just one of many, or a few of many different patterns that these rugs are woven in, and they are done with great intention. One important pattern that we saw is bote, which is a flame pattern. It's also Persian for a cluster of leaves. So it was something that's been used for centuries, both in the Middle East and in India, as a key motif. You see it all over this carpet. That's sort of a teardrop shaped pattern on the carpet. The rug colors also have symbolism, green being the color of Muhammad and the color of life, hope, and spring. Red, a color of beauty, wealth, luck, joy, and courage. Blue, the color of power, solitude, and the afterlife. Orange, humility and piety. White, purity. Black, destruction. Gold, wealth and power, and brown, fertility. So not only do the patterns have symbolism, so do the colors within the carpet. We talked about the Taj Mahal with the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan building this beautiful mausoleum in tribute to his third wife Mumtaz Mahal. But today we're going to talk about the gardens surrounding the Taj Mahal, which is a beautiful example of an Islamic garden. So Islamic gardens are divided into 4 quadrants, and these 4 sections are divided by walkways and typically a water channel like this. The gardens are intended for rest, reflection, contemplation, and just walking to create a peaceful sensory experience with water features, fragrant plants, and this is also to provide rest from hot climates. So oftentimes they will also incorporate courtyards with fountains and again, like a water feature or water channel like you see here. There's an important thought in the Quran that God made every living thing of water. So water becomes a very important symbol in Islamic design. And so you come to the garden to interact with the water. And the water is symbolizing the 4 rivers of paradise. That's why it's called a paradise garden, going in the 4 cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. It's the idea is to create kind of a Garden of Eden oasis. So also the water is to provide kinetic motion and sound. So it's you hear the sound of the water falling, and you see the side of the water rippling, and that brings you more peace, as we know. Also, these wall gardens were popular from ancient Persia, where they would grow all kinds of different flowers, from hibiscus, irises, jasmine. Of course, we know about the water lotus, fruit trees such as date palms, and roses were a popular thing to cultivate in these paradise gardens. The paradise garden typically has a wall around it to again separate it from the outer world. So it is meant to be a retreat from the outer world, and in it this kind of sensory delight with all of these beautiful sights, sounds, and fragrances, and that oasis of peace.